On the Trayvon tale, Hannity floated questions with a cross-examiner's skill, and yet he never applied that profile principle to Iraq by asking, does this fit the profile of a top-tier nuclear scientist, a guy with a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering, with an ancillary role in the uranium enrichment industry? While the Department of Energy's Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the 1980s, Joe Turner tested and operated centrifuges, but he has no design or development experience in their incredibly complex theory. Does it stand to reason that this engineer turned CIA analyst would become the arbiter of the aluminum tubes intel, trumping all the true experts, including the world-renowned nuclear scientist Dr. Houston Wood, who actually created and ran the centrifuge department at Oak Ridge? Imagery of a mushroom cloud was a masterful marketing gimmick, as the only two pieces of evidence around the nuclear charge were the aluminum tubes and uranium out of Africa, both of which were bogus beyond belief. Everybody believed Iraq had WD is not a valid argument any more than armed only with Skittles. Such fragments of folly are nothing more than empty slogans to serve a narrative. Arguing their views in good faith demands discernment, the willingness to examine all factors instead of seizing on one-dimensional elements for inadequate conclusions. For over a decade, the intricacies of the evidence were known only to those who took the time to study. I'm out to remedy that. The Iraq War issue is more important to me than any other, and I've spent over 10 years combing thousands of pages and writing about my findings. Bob Woodward captures my concern best in his 1991 book called The Commanders. The decision to go to war is one that defines a nation, both to the world and, perhaps more importantly, to itself. There is no more serious business for a national government, no more accurate measure of national leadership. Central to my examination is that I will illustrate the shallowness in Colin Powell's UN speech in February 2003. The media typically rushes over everything and explains nothing. I am taking the opposite approach with my isolated look at the aluminum tubes, and insight into that intelligence scheme is a roadmap to the rest. The only way to truly understand the story is to juxtapose the relationships of the relevant players involved. That includes the intelligence community, Congress, the Bush administration, the media, the intelligence investigations, and even our role in fostering it all. I like Powell as much as the next person, but it was way over the top to believe that this guy was infallible. You couldn't tell that to some people, though. One of the most intelligent and ordinarily reasonable individuals I've ever known was even seduced by the secretary. In defense of Powell, my English professor friend wrote, I am amazed that people are surprised that we might have been wrong in our assessment of Iraq. We are not dealing with exact science here, but a series of conclusions based always on partial evidence. Actually, on the aluminum tube front, we are dealing with an exact science. In the timeless classic 12 Angry Men, Henry Fonda's character stood alone in his quest to examine the evidence before prematurely rendering judgment. He doesn't get much traction early on, but sticking that duplicate knife into the table worked wonders, opening the door for the L-Trax inquiry.
Let's take two pieces of testimony and try to put them together.
Bill Cosby was saying essentially the same thing on his picture pages program back in the day, and everything in my offering is founded on the simplicity of this principle.
The deal is that we connect these dots, you see.
Last July, I drove up to the University of Virginia to interview Professor Wood. He's among the elite of experts in uranium enrichment, but he's been the gold standard source in this subject since the beginning. As investigative journalist Liz Jackson so perfectly put it in her aptly named Spinning the Tubes documentary,
if anyone cared to get the final word on tubes, rotors, gas centrifuges and uranium enrichment, this was the man to ask.
Since 1998, his efforts to reconstitute his nuclear program have been focused on acquiring the third and last component, sufficient fissile material to produce a nuclear explosion. To make the fissile material, he needs to develop an ability to enrich uranium. Saddam Hussein is determined to get his hands on a nuclear bomb. He is so determined that he has made repeated covert attempts to acquire high-specification aluminum tubes from 11 different countries, even after inspections resumed.
Powell's definition of covert cannot be found in any dimension of reality. According to Hubris, a masterpiece by Michael Isikoff and David Korn, Iraq obtained the tubes by sending out multiple purchase orders and faxing them to international suppliers, and then haggling over the prices, even advertised for the tubes on the internet.
By now, just about everyone has heard of these tubes, and we all know that there are differences of opinion. There is controversy about what these tubes are for. Most U.S. experts think they are intended to serve as rotors in centrifuges used to enrich uranium. Other experts and the Iraqis themselves argue that they are really to produce the rocket bodies for a conventional weapon a multiple rocket launcher.
In an October 2003 broadcast of 60 Minutes 2, Wood said,
I thought when I read that there must be some other tubes that people were talking about. I just was flabbergasted that people were still pushing that those might be centrifuges.
Flabbergasted?
Yeah, yeah. So it didn't make any sense to me. Science was not pushing this forward. Scientists had made their evaluation, had made their determination, and now we didn't know what was happening. Most experts are located in Oak Ridge, and that was not the position there.
Do you know one in academia, in government, in a foreign country, who disagrees with your appraisal, who says, yes, these are for nuclear weapons?
I don't know a single one anywhere. My conclusion was that these did not look like devices that could be used for centrifuges. So it would be highly unlikely that this could be a centrifuge rotor.
The walls of the tubes were too thick. Every one of the 60,000 tubes would need to be shaved down.
These were on the order of 3 millimeters thickness, so much more material than you would want to have in a high-speed rotor.
Their mass was too great.
You want the mass to be as small as possible so you can contain this high-speed rotating device.
And they would create leakage.
The gas would just be leaking out of the rotor, and you'd have to have pumps to continually pump that. Scientifically, these tubes do not fit the mold of gas centrifuges, period.